So Dana White's Contender Series 2024 is going to start taking place at the end of August. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about every single prospect that I've been keeping my eye on for over the last few months, and pretty much every fighter that I think should be on the Contender Series, and doing each different video in weight classes. My flyweight video should already be up, and this one is the bantamweight video. I do want to say before I get into this one, there are so many talented bantamweights all over the world, and there's probably going to be a lot that I'm going to miss in this video, just because it is genuinely a stacked weight class where there is so much talent. But I do think I've done quite well to talk about at least the main bantamweights that really are making a big splash in the world right now, and definitely should be on the Contender Series, and if not, signs to the UFC. So if you like keeping an eye out on prospects, definitely keep an eye on my channel, as I will be doing videos for every single weight class that the UFC does do. So let's start out with my first ever bantamweight, and I'm actually going to start out with a returning fighter that has been on the Contender Series before, and Andres Luna Martinetti. He actually fought at 125 pounds, and he lost to Alessandro Costa in a pretty close decision, but Costa is now in the UFC, is now finding his own success in the UFC as well, and I believe since then Martinetti has moved up to 135 pounds, and he's already won a couple of fights since then. He's beaten decent opponents, but it's pretty up and down. He's got a 14-1 record, but of course he is first, as he will be returning to the Contender Series if he does get selected. But he's got a brother that also is 14-1 called Adrian Luna Martinetti, who also fights at bantamweight. So of course they will be training with each other, and they're also both from Ecuador, which I'm sure is a area of the world that I think the UFC probably wants to target. And how cool would it be to have both Martinetti brothers on the same card? And I've actually got a little bit of a brother theme throughout this video, because there's a lot of brothers at bantamweight, which is kind of surprising. But Adrian Martinetti, I should say, because there's two of them, is also a good prospect. He's 14-1. He's also fought some pretty decent competition, but also some iffy competition as well in his career. But both of these guys, you know, they've had 15 pro fights and have a fantastic record. It would be doing them a disservice, I feel, to not test them out on the Contender Series. And now we're going to start off with another, I guess, pair of brothers, with Hussein Shakayev and his brother Kasain Shakayev. But to talk about Hussein Shakayev first, I think he probably is one of the best unsigned prospects right now. There is a little bit of an issue which I will definitely touch over, and that is that he hasn't fought since 2021, but I believe it's because he was having contract issues with his promotion at the time, ACA, which is a Russian promotion, if I do think so, and they have a lot of really talented fighters there, but I do believe they have exclusive contracts, and Hussein was having issues with that. He was meant to fight Michele Lima in the LFA, but instead he has had to pull out for some reason. I know that he's in the USA at the moment. He's training at the USA with his brother, who has actually accepted the fight against Michele Lima in his place. So if Hussein Shakayev is able to beat Michele Lima, I think he's definitely another guy to keep your eye out for, because Hussein has also fought very good competition. I mean, he's 6-1, but he beat a 14-4 opponent, 21-5, 6-0, and 5-1. And this was when he was inexperienced as a professional. He has lost one fight, but that was 2 and a bit years ago. If he beats Michele Lima is 18-5. That will tell me that he's ready for the UFC, in my opinion. So I think you can do Hussein Shakayev and his brother Hussein Shakayev both on the same Contender Series episode as well, if you wanted to. And now we're going to start talking about the other prospects that are not brothers, I guess. And starting off with, in my opinion, the best bantamweight in the world right now that isn't signed to a major promotion is Felipe Lima. Now, there is a little bit of an asterisk on this one, I will admit, because he's actually the champion at Octagon, which is in its own right a massive promotion over in the Czech Republic. And he was actually given a UFC opportunity, which didn't end up happening, because he was meant to fight current UFC fighter Long Zhao on a Road to UFC event, and Long Zhao had to pull out. But since then, Long Zhao, I believe, is actually in the UFC because he won the Road to UFC finals. No, he didn't. He's qualified for the Road to UFC finals that never happened. sorry to overcomplicate things. The point is, the UFC knows who Felipe Lima is. He is a champion at Octagon, which could make things complicated with contracts, but I know that the UFC has signed former Octagon champions before. He's ready for the UFC. Austin Bashi is another fighter ready for the UFC, and he has been, in my opinion, for quite a while, but he has actually been saying that he wants to make sure he's ready for the UFC, because he wants to, when he signs to the UFC, know that he can really make a run for it. And if you ever look at his record, he's 11-0, and he has fought some really good opponents. I mean, Askar is a guy that a lot of guys in the UFC have tested themselves against. Pipe Vargas, I talked about at 125-pound video. He's another guy which a lot of really good fighters have beaten to get their 9-3 opponent, 8-1, 6-1. He did fight this guy Eric Vo, but Ricky Bandejas pulled out and Eric Vo fought him on short notice, so that just is what it is. Austin Bashi, he's ready for the UFC. He has said that he wants to wait until he's ready. I think he's ready now, and even then, if he just wants to test himself in the Contender Series, or the UFC wants to put him on the Contender Series, I think that makes sense as well. Let's move on to another undefeated fighter called Quang Le, who is from Vietnam. And to my knowledge, I could be incorrect in saying this, but I don't think the UFC has ever signed a fighter from Vietnam before. And Quang Le and An Ho, who I actually forgot to mention in my flyweight video, which I'm a little bit embarrassed about, but Quang Le is a bantamweight. He's ready. He's ready for the UFC. He knocked out a 6-3 opponent recently, very recently, actually, a couple of weeks ago. Cody Peterson's a good fighter that he beat. He did have a close fight against a 6-3 opponent last year, but I think at this point he's 32 years old. He's 8-0. Let's give him an opportunity on the Contender Series to potentially get into the UFC. I think he's a great fighter. He's 8-0. He's 32 years old. He's got power, and as you can tell by the size of him, he's a big boy for 135 pounds. Let's make it happen. Rodrigo Vera is a guy from Peru that has been grinding his way on the regional scene for a long time, and he is now 16-1-1. That would be one of the best records to ever fight on Dana White's Contender Series, and I do believe he's ready for the UFC as well. I mean, he isn't fighting the best guys, I will admit that, but he did beat Rickson Zenadim, and Rickson Zenadim actually fought on the Contender Series last year against Andre Lima, who is now, of course, in the UFC and was actually bitten in his UFC debut. Just to really tie things in there. But Rodrigo Vera beat Rickson Zenadim, who has been on the Contender Series before, so surely the UFC knows who he is, and he lost to Eduardo Matias Torres, who was on the Contender Series last year. That really complicates things for the video. I do apologize for that, but the point is, Vera's been fighting decent guys. Now, a lot of the guys he has beaten aren't great, but he has shown good skills. He has shown the ability to beat good opponents. He's 16-1-1. I think it's time for him to get an opportunity. The next one is Wilson Droni. And I actually found out last year, or I was told last year, that Wilson Droni had actually signed to the UFC. That was definitely incorrect, because he's definitely not in the UFC right now. In fact, he actually fought incredibly recently against Mark Gray and knocked him out in 93 seconds. Only 3 days ago, actually, now that I record this video. But I talked about Mark Gray, actually, on my flyweight video, because he had beaten someone on my list. But Wilson Droni just beat Mark Gray. So that really ties things out. As you can imagine, a lot of these prospects do fight against each other. Hopefully, I'm not making the video very hard to follow. But Droni, he has lost to Angel Pacheco, which is a pretty bad loss, even though Pacheco is in the UFC. But since then, he's had a good run. You know, he knocked out Ashik Ajim, who was on the Contender Series in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. He knocked out a 7-3 opponent, knocked out Mark Gray, who was 6-0, and is a good prospect himself. Wilson Droni, he's from Albania. I don't think the UFC has any Albanian fighters aside from Denis Bazooka, but I'm not 100% sure if Bazooka was born in Albania. Anyway, besides the point, Droni would be one of the first Albanian fighters in the UFC if he was given the opportunity. 32 years old, good fighter. I mean, he didn't really have that much power until recently. He's knocking guys out silly now, which is cool to see. I think he would be good. Another fighter, he's from Australia, and his name is Cody Haddon. He's 25 years old, and he has had a war with Steve Erceg, who is now going to be fighting for the UFC World Flyweight Championship, and that fight against Steve Erceg was in 2021. It was less than 3 years ago, and I believe at that time, Cody Haddon was 22 years old when that fight with Steve Erceg did take place. It was an absolute war. It was a great fight. Steve Erceg did end up winning it, but since then, Cody Haddon's gone on a run. He knocked out a 5-0 opponent, and then he's beaten some good guys. 19-12, an opponent with a lot of experience, was able to finish him in a minute. And then he finished Paul Loga, who, once again, very experienced opponent, 16 pro fights, 9-7. Got it done there, beat Paul Loga. He's beaten some good guys, he's beaten some experienced guys. I think at this point, you might as well give him a shot at the Contender Series. Another guy that I think is deserving and was actually on my list last year is John Sweeny. And John Sweeny hasn't fought since he beat Alan Bagoso. And if I'm not mistaken, this was for the LFA Bantamweight Championship. It was. And when he beat Alan Bagoso, he actually called out Moeen Gafarov, who at the time I don't think was signed to the UFC, but now he is in the UFC. So maybe they could do John Sweeny versus Moeen Gafarov in the UFC, or give John Sweeny an opportunity on the Contender Series. I know he wins a lot of decisions, but he's got a very fun personality, and I think he's also got a pretty fun fighting style. Like, I know he's not finishing a lot of his opponents, but he's a fun fighter to watch. He does wrestle a lot, but he's very offensive in that. He's a decent striker as well. He's fun on the microphone. I think he's definitely a guy that the UFC would quite like to have in their promotion. Another fighter that's definitely deserving is Liam Gittins, and he beat a guy recently that was on my list called Roberto Hernandez. Roberto Hernandez was actually on my list, but then Liam Gittins goes out there, submits him in round 5, and here he is. Now he's on the list. He's on a good win streak too, and he beat Rhys McEwen, who's a very up-and-coming, promising Scottish fighter, if I can remember off the top of my head. Yes, got it. Anyway, Liam Gittins, he's a very good Muay Thai striker. He does have grappling in his game, as we saw recently. He's 13-4, he's experienced, but he's beaten some of the best guys that Cage Warriors can give him. I think he's ready now for an opportunity on the Contender Series. And now we've got a fight, actually. Nkosi Indelli taking on Jose Torres. If Nkosi Indelli wins, he goes on the Contender Series, in my opinion, because he hasn't really beaten the best guys in the world. But now he's got a trilogy coming up. Lost a split decision to Jose Torres, Jose Shorty Torres, by the way, who's a really, really good fighter and actually had a fantastic run in the UFC, but then they cut 125 pounds. He's actually the only guy to defeat Amir Albazi. Nkosi Indelli lost a split decision to Jose Torres, finished him in round 3, and now they are doing a trilogy. And I feel like if Jose Torres wins this fight, the UFC should sign him. But if Nkosi Indelli wins the fight, then the UFC should put him on the Contender Series or sign him as well. He's from South Africa. The UFC, I could imagine, probably wants to sign more fighters from Africa. In fact, Dana White himself has said that they want to go to Africa at some point, and maybe this year or next year. Nkosi Indelli, he's a South African fighter that's really, really good. That's kind of what I've got there. So I've got a fight. I've actually got another fight on this one here, so whoever wins that fight should be on there too. David Martinez is a bantamweight from Mexico. If I do remember him correctly, he's fighting at Combate Global, and he is, yes, and he's knocking out everybody. He's been beating some experienced guys, 23-9, and then a 5-1 opponent with a good record. Undefeated guy, 2-0, 14-7, just more experienced guys, I guess you could say, and he's knocking them all out. And recently, he's got 3 KOs in a row, 2 of them in the 4th round. So that tells you he can push a pace and he can finish a fight late. And he's got experience going past 3 rounds as well, which could be somewhat important, I guess, to know that he can push a 3-round pace if he was to fight on the Contender Series. So I've got him on this list. 25 years old, from Mexico. UFC wants more Mexican fighters. 10-1. He can knock people out. It's as simple as that. Abdul Kamar. This is a guy I'm a little bit nervous about because he is a tough fight coming up next, man. But my goodness, if Abdul Kamar wins that fight, UFC definitely needs to give this guy a shot. He is 19 years old. 19 years old, but he's 10-1. Made his debut in MMA in 2020 when he was 15. I thought he was going to 16. He's 15. 15 years old when he beat Shokshan Wang, who's also on this list, by the way, towards the end of the video, though. Abdul Kamar. He's gone out there and he's doing his own thing. Recently just knocked out Murad Kurbanov, who is a good fighter. And now he's taking on another guy called Ivan Pashikov, who is no bum, because Ivan Pachikov is a former one championship fighter who fought some decent guys there as well, and he beat a couple of good guys in one championship. So Abdul Kamar, at the age of barely even 19 years old, is going to be taking on Ivan Pashikov here at 135 pounds. If he beats Ivan Pachikov, the UFC wants fighters from China. You've got an incredibly young, good prospect from China here in Agula Lee. 10-1 record, potentially, hopefully, 11-1 for this video's sake. Hopefully this doesn't end poorly and Agula Lee loses, but I really do think that he is one of the better guys out of China right now, and he's only 19, which is crazy. Rafael Pereira is 11-4. He actually beats a guy that was on my list, to be honest with you. Fernando Lourenço was on my list. He was 17-3 at the time on a massive win streak. And you know what happens? He fights this guy called Rafael Pereira, and he gets submitted in 51 seconds. So, congratulations, Rafael Pereira. You're now on my list, and you're probably going to be on Dana White's Contender Series. So, Rafael Pereira, 11-4. Lights out finishing ability, so many finishes in the first round. One of them over the 17-3 Fernando Lourenço. And even then, he's got Muay Thai experience as well as a professional. So there's a lot to digest here for Rafael Pereira. But he's definitely a guy that I think could be on the Contender Series. I will be honest, was not a guy I was looking at until he recently defeated Ben 10, also known as Fernando Lourenço. Now he's here. Let's move on. John Rodriguez Tacha, he is Tacha. I would assume he's from Colombia. I don't think the UFC has anyone from Colombia on... No, I could be wrong about that. I don't think the UFC has anyone from Colombia on their roster, but I could be wrong, and I'm willing to admit if I'm wrong on that one there, but even if then, John Rodriguez Tacha would be one of the first fighters in the UFC from Colombia if he can make it happen. He, once again, hasn't really beaten the best guys, but he's beaten an experienced fighter with 28 professional fights, 16-12, 12-2. Not a bad record, 2-1 win-loss ratio, and then another 2-1 win-loss ratio in a fight which he finished in the 4th round. So you can know that he can push 3 rounds if he has to, mostly knock guys out. 28 years old, from Colombia, could be one of the first guys from Colombia in the UFC. Malcolm Wellmaker is another guy that popped up on my radar pretty recently. He is 7-0, bantamweight, and he's been beating a couple of decent guys on the regional scene in the USA, but he went 9-1 as an amateur, so he's got experience outside of his professional career. Beat an experienced 11-7 opponent, and this is where I found out who he was when he beat Taylor Moore. But then he beat a 5-2 opponent, knocked him out in the 2nd round. Malcolm Wellmaker, 7-0 from the USA. I mean, this is kind of the perfect guy to put on the Contender Series, is it not? Christian Rivas versus Ali Wasuk is another fight that I have here. Ali Wasuk is actually the guy that was on the list, but he's matched up with this guy called Christian Rivas on the BFL event, which is going to be in Canada, I believe. So a hometown fight for Ali Wasuk, but Christian Rivas has fought good fighters because he has fought Peyton Talbot. That's what I was looking for. And he did give Peyton Talbot a relatively difficult fight because he did take down Talbot a couple of times, and now Talbot's going to be an absolute superstar. So if Christian Rivas can beat Ali Wasuk, he's kind of got some credentials to lay on there. He's 11-3, could be on the Contender Series, but Ali Wasuk is the guy that I am looking at. He's from Canada. The UFC wants more fighters from Canada. It just makes sense. But the winner of this fight, if Christian Rivas beats Ali Wasuk, then he should be on the Contender Series. He's from Ecuador. Yeah, that's kind of it. The next one is an experienced fighter with 23 professional fights, but he's been on one hell of a run recently, man. Filipe Araujo, knocking people out silly. Knocked out Mana Martinez in 53 seconds. Finished this guy by injury. First round TKO, though, over an 8-2 opponent. And then he's been knocking people out that have pretty poor records, losing records. But he had a losing streak at one point, but Stephen Lohman is a guy that's at one championship, absolutely making things happen. Franz Malambo's in the PFL right now, if I'm not mistaken. I am correct in saying that. And Matheus Nicolau is headlining a UFC event soon. So those 3 losses that he had in a row are not bad losses whatsoever. So I don't really hold those losses against Felipe Araujo too much. And he just knocked out the former UFC fighter, Mana Martinez, in 53 seconds. UFC, it's time. I know that Felipe Araujo's got a bad record, but he's only 30 years old, and he does fight out of shooter box. He's a fun guy. He just knocked out Mana Martinez in 53 seconds. Mana Martinez is a dangerous guy. Let's move on. Michele Martel. In my opinion, in hindsight, though, this is a big hindsight thing, and actually at the time I was supportive of it, so I'm not going to be hypocritical. I'm going to say this. Michele Martel was the champion at 135 pounds, defeated Dominic Wooden, but then he decided that he was going to go down to 125 pounds after winning the belt at 135, go down to 125, and take on Shadajul Huck. Martignoni, in hindsight, at 125 pounds was a bad idea. He looked slow, and he didn't look good at 125. Lost to Huck, as you can tell, he lost the decision. But he come back to 135 against Razbring, who's not a bad fighter by any means, and he knocked him out in the first round. Martignoni's back. He's back at 135, his natural weight class. From Italy, I don't think the UFC has that many Italian fighters, and the UFC has been rumored for a long time to be going back to Italy. That's why I've got him there. This is a fun name to say, I'll be honest. Tokitaka Nakanishi, 11-3, on once again, just like Felipe Araujo. One hell of a run right now, I'll be honest. He's beaten some very, very good fighters recently, and he's been, he started 1-2 in his career, and since then, what's he gone? Like 10-1? Is that how he's gone? 10-1 in his last 11 fights. One of those losses to a pretty poor opponent, but aside from that, 15-8, 10-6, 12-7, 12-5, 17-14. Experienced opponents. Beat a guy that was 9-3 as well. That's probably his best win, I would say, without looking too deep into it. Making things happen in Pancrase. Tokitaka Nakanishi. You can't tell me that's not a fun name to say as well. Tokitaka, I think that he's a guy from Japan that the UFC could look into signing. Maybe he's going to be on the road to UFC tournament, but the UFC, Dana White said when they signed... Oh no, I've forgotten his name. This is horrific. When they signed the Japanese fighter who's blonde, who got disqualified for stomping his opponent on his head. What is his name? He lost to Billy Goff. Give me 1 second, actually. This is a horrific change. But Dana White said when he signed this fighter that lost to Billy Goff, called Yusaku Kinoshita, he said that Dana White himself said he's always looking for the next Japanese star. They want to get more Japanese fighters in the UFC. They thought that Yusaku Kinoshita could be one of those guys that could become a star for them. And I do believe that he probably could, because he is a very fun fighter to watch. He just hasn't had the best run in the UFC so far, which is quite unfortunate, but he's a fun fighter. The point is, Dana White said that they're looking for another Japanese star. Give Tokitaka Nakanishi an opportunity because his name is so fun to say. And he's a fun fighter too. He gets a lot of finishes, so let's do it. I'm sorry for that horrific kind of side, but we're 22 minutes into the video. I feel like 99% of the people that started watching the video are probably not watching anymore. Abdul Kamar, 8-1. He's from Sierra Leone. The UFC, I don't think, has a fighter representing Sierra Leone. I could be incorrect about saying that again. Born in Sierra Leone, UFC doesn't have anyone from Sierra Leone. Let's get more international fighters in the UFC, and not only that, he's a good fighter as well. Beat Pepe Torres in Icon FC, and then his brother, no, I'm just kidding, not his brother, but then he beat another guy called Shane Torres in Fury FC, and he's gone on a bit of a run since then. Let's just make it happen. Abdul Kamar on Dana White's Contender Series. Amari Singh Savan is another guy, 6-0. Once again, could be 7-0, which I do think he probably will be. I do think he's going to beat this guy called Thomas Prestige. 7-0 from the USA. Beat Khabib Gordon as well, by the way, which is I think Khabib Gordon is from Israel, but he trains for shooter box in Brazil. I'm correct in saying that. But yeah, kind of a random win there, but that's cool. And Khabib Gordon's gone on to win some fights in his own right too. So, good win. Amari Singh Shavan on Dana White's Contender Series, 7-0 from the USA. Gage Gill, 24 years old, 6-0 from the USA. Just makes sense. Actually, he's finished every single one of his opponents in the first round as well. And one of them was a good guy. 6-3, DeAndre Anderson has experience as an amateur, went 5-2, 7 amateur fights. Good record. First round finishes galore. I mean, why would you not want this guy on the Contender Series? Need I say more? Shokshan Wang. I just talked about Shokshan Wang because he lost to Agul Ali in Agul Ali's debut. But since then, this man has been on a mission. He's on a 7-fight win streak over good guys. He beat this guy called Doolali, who was 37-11 and 37-12 twice. And before that, he beat a 30-7 opponent as well. So yeah, Shokshan Wang from China. The UFC wants more fighters from China, I think. Let's do it. Elijah Smith, the son of Gilbert Smith, a guy that was on, I believe, the Ultimate Fighter twice, actually, and fought in the UFC. So this is a UFC fighter's son in Elijah Smith. Do I think he's UFC ready right now? Probably not. I don't want to be disrespectful to him, but he's a guy I'm keeping my eye on, to be honest, because he's a nice striker, dude. This guy looked good. I know he got knocked out by Reyes Cortez, but I thought he was looking good in that matchup before he did get knocked out. And since then, he's beaten good guys, man. This guy's a good fighter. He's a good striker, long, rangy striker, solid fighter. And then Marlon Basilo versus Vinicius Perez. Just to end off the video, I have a fight. The winner of this fight, put them on the Contender Series. I think it just makes sense to me. That's it for the video. That's it for Bantamweight. I probably missed a few guys, but let me know what you think. And the next video will be my featherweight video, which I think is lacking a little bit. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of last minute research, I think, because I think I've only got like 15 featherweights, which I don't think is anywhere near as much bantamweights as I had. But anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one.